This video will help you understand the ABC Trust strategy to decide if it's right for your family's estate planning. If you don't know who I am, my name is Chris Dime. I'm a certified financial planner out of Edmonds, Washington, and I specialize in working with folks to and through retirement. So as it pertains to estate planning, most of the time, things like wills, powers of attorney, healthcare directives, etc., those are going to satisfy the needs of most families. However, as net worth climbs and maybe the family dynamic gets a bit more complicated with kids from, previous marriages, for example, the necessity for some more advanced estate planning could come into play. And it could very much help in minimizing the impact of either state or federal estate taxes. So in this video, we'll break down how combining a few advanced estate planning strategies can help to not only minimize the impact of estate taxes, but ensure the surviving spouse is well taken care of, while also dictating where proceeds go long after you're gone. So let's jump in. So for a quick refresher on estate taxes, when a married couple has one person pass away, the estate in total is going to be worth X amount. And in a perfect world, either things have been titled appropriately, so the estate is pretty much split down the middle between spouse one and spouse two, or maybe they've planned ahead of time and they've moved everything into some type of joint revocable trust, which helps them also avoid probate, but at the same time divides things pretty much evenly down the middle. So as it stands today, if the first decedent's share of the estate is worth less than $12.9 million, for the most part, they probably don't need to worry about any sort of federal estate taxation. Now, that $12.9 million is going to be somewhere in the ballpark of $7 million we project in 2026. So that's probably the federal exemption number I would plan for if I were you. But again, as long as assets for the first decedent's share is worth less than $7 million, then probably there won't be anything to worry about by way of federal estate taxes. That being said, a number of states have their own state estate tax exemption that you're going to want to be aware of, and those are much smaller exemption levels than the federal level. I'll link below to see if your state has a state level estate tax, and if so, how much that exemption is. A lot of states don't, but nonetheless, I'll link below. On the contrary, if the first decedent's assets exceed either their local state or the federal exemption level, you will want to be mindful of estate taxes so that you can maximize the impact on either the next generation or organizations you're trying to leave money to after you're gone. One of the most common strategies for folks in a situation like this is to combine a few advanced estate planning strategies known as the ABC Trust strategy. And ABC just stands for the shorthand name for the trusts that get created upon the death of the first spouse. So A trust would stand for survivor's trust, B trust would stand for bypass trust or credit shelter trust, and the C trust would stand for the QTIP trust. Let's start with the A trust. The A trust is made up of the surviving spouse's share of the total estate, which, to keep it simple, let's just say they divide the estate in half. That means the surviving spouse has unfettered access to this property. They can do whatever they want with it. In addition, since it was already their share of the estate, there won't be any sort of estate taxes owed at the time of the first death. These assets are totally controlled by the survivor, which means upon the survivor's death, these assets, or whatever's left of them, will be included in the estate of the survivor. And that person may or may not owe estate taxes, depending on rules and regulations and depending on what the asset size was at that time. The B trust or the bypass trust, also known as the credit shelter trust or exemption trust, that is the trust that's created and gets funded by up to the exemption level for the decedent. So said another way, if this person's in Washington state, for example, and they pass away, up to $2.2 million, which is the Washington state estate tax exemption, would go into a bypass trust. They're using their exemption, they're funding a bypass trust. They can have that money go to whoever they want to because they can do up to the exemption level. They can do whatever they want with that money. That money would not be taxable as part of the estate, nor would it be taxable upon the death of the surviving spouse in the future. This money is completely bypassing any sort of estate taxes, hence the name bypass trust. The bypass trust is particularly valuable when the state estate tax exemption is non-portable, meaning the first decedent can't transfer their exemption over to the surviving spouse, who can then, double up on their own exemption upon their eventual demise. In a state like Washington that has a non-portable state estate tax exemption, if the first decedent to die doesn't use their exemption, the family loses that ability. Now, the surviving spouse will still have their state estate tax exemption, but they don't get to add the two exemptions together. That's contrary to how things work on the federal level, where as of now, the individual exemptions are portable, meaning upon my death, if I don't use my federal estate tax exemption, I'm allowed to transfer that over to my surviving spouse, who can then double up their estate tax exemption. After the first spouse's death, the surviving spouse will still have the ability to access money in the bypass trust if needed via the HEMS provision or health, education, maintenance, and support. So the surviving spouse isn't totally SOL if assets are needed from the bypass trust. Now, the third trust in this equation is called the QTIP Trust. I did a video on QTIP Trust a little bit ago. You can check that out if you want a little bit more nuance. But to keep it very simple, the QTIP Trust is essentially a way to pass property to the surviving spouse, qualify for the unlimited marital deduction, but have already dictated where the rest of that money will go upon the death of the surviving spouse. Now, normally, if you give someone what's called a terminable interest, which QTIP stands for Qualified Terminable Interest Property Trust. Now, normally, if you give someone a terminable interest in property, that would not qualify for a marital deduction, especially if you're already dictating where that money will eventually go. But relative to making a QTIP election on the estate tax return of the first death, you will be able to qualify for the unlimited marital deduction if you set everything up accordingly, while still also dictating where the remaining of those assets end up. Now, since the surviving spouse has access to the income in the QTIP trust, that does mean that upon the surviving spouse's death, they will need to include these assets in their estate. And again, it may or may not be taxable based on rules at the time or based on how much assets are left inside the QTIP. Now, the QTIP trust is particularly valuable when you, as the first decedent, want to ensure that particular beneficiaries are well taken care of long after you're gone. As opposed to outright just gifting all this money to the surviving spouse, which you could totally do, you unfortunately have no, guarantee, or the beneficiaries that you want money to go to have no insulation of the surviving spouse changing their mind, maybe remarrying, whatever. This is oftentimes most seen in blended families where there are kiddos from previous marriages and the decedent wants to make sure that those kiddos are well taken care of, despite what might happen between the surviving spouse and kiddos from a previous marriage. There's of course other situations you can think of where, as somebody with wealth, you'd want to ensure that particular beneficiaries are well taken care of while not preventing the surviving spouse from also being taken care of, and that's where the QTIP can really shine. Keep in mind, if changes of heart are not a concern of yours for estate planning, you could totally just rock and roll with setting up a A trust and a B trust and then just gifting all your share of the assets to the surviving spouse. All that would escape federal and state level estate taxes upon the first death. Now, the surviving spouse will need to include all those assets in their estate when they eventually pass away, but at least the first person to die escapes estate taxes at that time. So we've got a little bit of time left, so let's run through a quick example using a couple in Washington state and how the ABC trust strategy would play out. So we'll take a hypothetical couple of Chris and Kayla, and we'll say that their estate is worth $10 million in total. As it stands today, there would be no federal estate tax concerns at this time because they're both well under the exemption levels on the federal level. But on the state level, Washington state has a $2.2 million Washington state estate tax exemption. So if they take that 10 million and they split it down the middle, 5 million to Chris, 5 million to Kayla upon Chris's death, then there very much could be some Washington state estate tax liability if they don't plan accordingly. So let's keep it simple and say the estate was worth 10 million, Chris's share is 5, Kayla's share is 5. Upon Chris's death, this 5 million that pretty much already belonged to Kayla would go to Kayla in the form of a trust or survivor's trust, which is a revocable living trust. She can do whatever she wants with this money. She could spend it all, whatever. This 5 million is not included in Chris's estate for the purposes of estate tax calculations. Now that 5 million will be included in Kayla's estate, or however much that's grown to or has shrunk by. That will be included in her estate for estate tax calculations, and she may or may not owe estate taxes when she passes away. But for sure, Chris will not owe estate taxes on that 5 million. Now, of Chris's share of 5 million, up to 2.2 million would be siphoned off and go into the B trust or bypass trust or credit shelter trust. This 2.2 million is the Washington state estate tax exemption, and this money gets used and put into a bypass trust to go to beneficiaries in the future after Kayla passes away. This money has successfully bypassed Washington state estate taxes. Now, the resources in the bypass trust are still technically accessible by Kayla if she needs it, but it's not a trust that's set up solely for her benefit, so it doesn't qualify for an unlimited marital deduction, nor would it be included in Kayla's estate when she passes away. It's successfully bypassed estate taxes when Chris dies and when Kayla dies. So of Chris's share of 5 million in the estate, 2.2 is moved into a bypass trust. That leaves 2.8 million remaining. Chris could gift that all to Kayla and be done with his estate planning. Or if he wants just a little bit more control after he's gone, he would have that 2.8 million or however much of it go into a QTIP trust or a C trust. And maybe Chris's kids from his previous marriage are listed as the beneficiaries on that QTIP trust after Kayla passes away. Kayla has access to the income produced by the QTIP trust, theoretically could access the principal if needed, but whatever's left over in that QTIP trust or whatever it's grown to is sent to the beneficiaries that Chris originally instructed that they would go to when Kayla passes away. That being said, though the 2.8 million that gets transferred to the QTIP trust does not get estate taxed at Chris's death, upon Kayla's death, the resources in the QTIP trust will be included in her estate because she was able to access income and potentially principal out of the QTIP trust during her lifetime. So calls to action wise, well, number one, if you're currently at or you forecast being above the exemption levels for your state or for the future federal estate tax exemption, which again, we're forecasting to be somewhere in the ballpark of about 7 million. It'd probably be in your best interest to speak to your financial planner and your estate planning attorney around the smart strategies to ensure you're minimizing the impact of estate taxes while also providing for the surviving spouse and maybe having some additional control as to where some of those assets end up after the second spouse passes away. So hopefully that was helpful. If you have further questions, drop them in the chat below or get in touch on the website. We'll get you squared away. Have an awesome rest of the week. We'll talk to you later. Bye.